Princess Charlotte stood beside Queen Camilla, silent, still and shaking. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked up at the royal guard and cried out, "Please help me." And in that moment, he did something no guard had done in over 360 years. He broke the sacred protocol and stepped forward. Before we show you exactly what happened in those frozen seconds, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The forecourt at Buckingham Palace has its own weather. Even on the busiest London morning, when the streets beyond the black iron gates buzz with taxis and tour buses, the ancient cobblestones seem to muffle sound instead of echoing it. The cream-coloured stone walls hold the spring sunlight and warm it, creating pockets of golden air that make tourists pause mid-sentence and reach for their cameras without quite knowing why. Today was one of those perfect ceremonial mornings, the kind where every brass fitting gleamed, every flag hung just right, and the scarlet tunics of the guards looked like they'd been painted against the pale backdrop. From somewhere beyond the main gates, the regimental band was running through their warm-ups, brass instruments, calling back and forth across the courtyard in notes that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. The barriers were already packed 3 deep. German tourists with telephoto lenses had claimed the prime spots hours ago. American families clutched guidebooks and checked their phones for the best angles. A group of Japanese visitors had set up what looked like a small photographic operation and weren't budging until the last note faded. Everyone pressed forward with that mix of excitement and respect you only see at places where history isn't just remembered, but still happening every day. Behind the public barriers, separated by polished chain and the quiet presence of palace security, a much smaller section had been cordoned off. Most visitors never even noticed it existed. No tour guides pointed there. No cameras lingered without permission. At the centre of this protected space stood a girl who could have walked straight out of a portrait gallery. 10 years old, with the kind of sharp, clear features that marked her as unmistakably royal. Her pale blue coat was pressed to perfection, her shoes reflected the morning light like mirrors, and her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested serious adult attention. Princess Charlotte of Wales stood with her hands clasped in front of her, not fidgeting like most children her age, watching the guards with intense concentration. Her gaze tracked their movements, studied their positioning, analysed their bearing, with the focused attention of someone who understood she was witnessing something important. Lance Corporal Theo Renner registered her presence without turning his head. At 32, he was older than most of the soldiers rotating through ceremonial duties, and it showed in his bearing. The bearskin hat that crowned his already tall frame cast his face in deep shadow, but beneath that shadow were eyes that missed nothing. 2 tours in Helmand had given him those eyes. The survival habit of reading crowds, measuring distances, spotting the subtle signals that separated normal behaviour from potential threat. Where other people saw tourists admiring pageantry, Renner noticed the man checking exits instead of taking photos, the woman tracking guard movements instead of soaking up the spectacle. His left knee carried a dull ache, where shrapnel had found its mark during his final patrol. The injury that eventually brought him home and into the scarlet tunic of ceremonial duty. Some of his mates saw the assignment as a step down from active combat. Renner understood it differently. The threat environment had changed, not disappeared. Here in the heart of London, vigilance was still survival. Standing motionless for hours was its own kind of endurance test, but he'd learned to use the stillness productively. His eyes worked constantly beneath the bearskin's shadow, cataloguing faces, tracking patterns, noting small inconsistencies that might matter when they mattered most. Right now, something was making his training whisper warnings he couldn't quite name. It wasn't the crowd. The tourists were behaving exactly as expected. Pressed against barriers, phones ready, that reverent buzz of anticipation that came before any major ceremony. It was the royal section that bothered him. Princess Charlotte stood perfectly still, perfectly dressed, perfectly positioned. Everything about her appearance screamed careful preparation, but there was something in her posture, something about the way she held herself that didn't match the polish. She looked tense, not excited tense, worried tense. Next to her, Queen Camilla maintained the kind of smile that photographers loved but never quite reached her eyes. Her hand rested on Charlotte's shoulder with what looked like grandmotherly affection from a distance. Up close, Renner could see the grip was firmer than it needed to be, the kind of hold that guided rather than comforted. Charlotte's gaze kept drifting toward his position. Quick glances at first, then longer looks, like something about his presence either unsettled or steadied her. Hard to tell with a child that well trained to hide her feelings. The band's warm-up was building toward the opening fanfare now, French horns weaving through percussion in melodies that had echoed through this courtyard for generations. Guards inside the gates began moving into formation, their boots striking cobblestone in perfect unison. Renner remained fixed to his post. In 12 years since leaving Afghanistan, 8 since he'd stopped jumping at car doors slamming, 3 since taking his first ceremonial posting, he'd never broken formation. Not once. Not when protesters threw bottles. Not when that drunk tourist last month had screamed abuse inches from his face. But something about this morning pressed differently against his chest. Charlotte looked at him again. Not a glance this time. A look. Direct. Searching. Like she was trying to decide something important. Her chin trembled once, so briefly he almost missed it. Renner's breathing stayed controlled, one inhale every 8 seconds, but his instincts started whispering louder. The same instincts that had warned him about roadside bombs in Sangin, that had felt the shift in air pressure before sniper rounds. Something wasn't right here. The ceremony was beginning in earnest now, the kind of pageantry that drew tourists from around the world. But just beyond the camera's reach, a different kind of performance was taking place. From the crowd's perspective, they saw royal elegance. A Queen Consort showing her granddaughter the pride of tradition, both of them framed by polished brass and centuries of history. The reality was something else entirely. Queen Camilla leaned down slightly, bringing her mouth level with Charlotte's ear. Her smile stayed frozen for the photographers, but her voice carried the kind of sharp edge that cut without raising volume. Chin up, back straight, stop slouching like you're waiting for a bus. Charlotte didn't respond. Didn't flinch either, but her jaw tightened and her gaze dropped to the cobblestones beneath her polished shoes. Renner saw the shift from 20 yards away, the barely visible tremor in the girl's hands, the way she rolled her shoulders, not to loosen tension, but to brace against it. Camilla's hand moved from Charlotte's shoulder to her wrist, still looked gentle from a distance. Wasn't. Renner recognized that grip from his time overseas, the kind used in crowds to control without attracting attention, fingers pressed just hard enough to sting without leaving marks. "Don't embarrass me," Camilla continued, her whisper barely audible. "Your breathing is too loud. This isn't some school play. You're representing the crown." Charlotte nodded silently. That was the part that made Renner's gut clench. She'd heard this before. Often enough to know exactly how to respond, how to minimize the consequences of disappointing someone who held power over her daily life. From the barriers, tourists raised their phones higher, trying to capture the perfect shot of royal tradition in action. They saw what they expected to see, what they'd been conditioned to see. Renner saw what was actually happening, a child being told she wasn't good enough, being gripped hard enough to hurt, being made smaller by someone who should have been protecting her. His breathing slowed further. He'd held position through mortar attacks without blinking, watched friends bleed out beside him without moving. He understood waiting, understood discipline. But this felt different. He watched Charlotte more closely now, not as a ceremonial guard, but as someone who'd seen pressure break people. The way she stood wasn't confident posture. It was defensive positioning, shoulders rounded inward slightly, weight shifted back on her heels, ready to retreat if necessary. The look of someone who'd learned that making herself smaller was safer than taking up space. Camilla moved again, adjusting Charlotte's coat with unnecessary force, smoothing fabric that didn't need smoothing. Her fingers landed near the girl's collarbone, thumb pressing inward just enough to make her point. Eyes forward! Stop looking around like a tourist. You are not here to gawk. You are here to perform. Charlotte's composure wavered for just a moment. Her lower lip trembled before she caught it between her teeth. She was 10 years old and fighting not to cry while hundreds of people watched her be perfect. Renner's grip on his rifle tightened fractionally. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to feel his own tension building. He'd been trained to recognize battlefield distress in all its forms, but no training had prepared him for recognizing it wrapped in royal blue and hidden behind ceremonial smiles. Charlotte looked toward him again. This time, her gaze lingered, like she was trying to communicate something she couldn't say aloud. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Renner felt something crack inside his chest, some barrier between duty to protocol and duty to basic human decency. His mind flashed back to Helmand, to a little Afghan girl who'd approached their checkpoint with her father. She'd been maybe Charlotte's age, same wide eyes, same careful way of standing when adults were talking above her head. They'd turned the father away. Orders were orders, no civilian access that day. He'd watched them walk back down the dusty road, the girl looking over her shoulder once with the same expression Charlotte wore. 2 days later, their compound took mortar fire. The same family's house was hit. When the medics got there, they found the girl first. She hadn't made it. Renner had carried that weight for 8 years. The knowledge that sometimes following orders meant failing the people you were supposed to protect. But he still didn't move, couldn't move. Not yet. To break formation was to break everything he'd sworn to uphold, even if keeping that oath meant watching another child suffer in silence while he stood and did nothing. A spring breeze stirred the forecourt, lifting flags and ruffling the careful arrangements that made everything look perfect for the cameras. One loose strand of Charlotte's precisely pinned hair curled across her cheek, and the pale blue ribbon that had held it in place slipped down toward her shoulder. It was the kind of small, natural moment that might have made her smile on a different morning. Instead, it triggered something much worse. Camilla's eyes locked onto the loose ribbon immediately. Her entire body went rigid, that frozen smile stretching tighter across her face. Her hand shot out with sudden precision, clamping down on Charlotte's upper arm. From the rope line, it looked protective, the kind of correction a concerned grandmother might make for a wardrobe issue. The reality was different. Renner could see the angle of the grip, the tension in Charlotte's neck, the tiny wince she tried to hide by turning slightly toward the crowd. And then the words came, hissed through clenched teeth, quiet enough that only someone trained to read lips could make them out. "You're a disgrace." Charlotte's left shoulder dipped involuntarily. For the first time since stepping into the forecourt, her carefully maintained composure began to crack. Camilla pulled her toward the interior of the royal section, just a step out of the crowd's direct line of sight. Her grip shifted higher, fingers digging into the soft tissue of Charlotte's upper arm, where no cameras would catch the marks that would form later. Renner didn't blink, didn't shift his stance, but the cold weight in his chest crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. He'd seen officers look away from things they didn't want to report, heard the sound of complicit silence when those in power abused it. His boots remained locked to the ancient stone, but every instinct he'd developed in 12 years of military service was screaming at him to act. Charlotte's voice came then, small, raw, barely more than a whisper. "Please don't." Not shouted, not performed for an audience, just said, like a prayer that didn't expect an answer. But Renner heard it. His training had sharpened his hearing to pick up whispers through chaos, distant threats through closer noise, emotion through careful control. Those 2 words rang in his bones, louder than artillery fire. Charlotte turned her head slightly, looking back over her shoulder with wide, wet eyes. Her gaze found his. Past Camilla, past the ceremonial chains, past every rule and regulation that kept him frozen in place. For 1 second, the entire courtyard seemed to slow down around them. The band marched through their formation, drums pounding in perfect rhythm. Tourists lifted phones to capture the spectacle unfolding before them. But Renner heard none of the music, saw none of the pageantry. He only saw her. Charlotte's voice cracked as she spoke again, this time loud enough for others to hear. "Please, help me!" The words cut through the morning air like a blade. Several tourists looked up from their cameras, confused, uncertain they'd heard correctly. But Lance Corporal Theo Renner had no uncertainty at all. The rifle in his hands suddenly felt different, lighter, more like a tool than a ceremonial prop. Behind him stood 3 centuries of unbroken tradition. Generations of guards who had never moved from their posts without direct orders, who had maintained perfect discipline regardless of circumstances. In front of him stood a 10-year-old girl in royal blue, asking for help that no one else was willing to provide. He shifted his weight, felt his right boot lift slightly from the ancient cobblestone. Then he took the first step. The sound echoed across the forecourt like a gunshot. It wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not ever. But Lance Corporal Theo Renner was already in motion, and 300 years of precedent shattered with each footfall. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled through the barriers as phones swung toward the unprecedented sight of a royal guard abandoning his position. The band faltered. Brass instruments trailed off mid-note as musicians turned to see what was causing the disruption. Renner kept walking, 2 steps, 3, 4, each one deliberate, controlled, inevitable as gravity. He wasn't rushing, wasn't charging, just moving with the steady purpose of someone who'd finally decided that some things mattered more than rules. Camilla turned at the sound, her hand dropping from Charlotte's arm as she processed what was happening. Her head swiveled in slow disbelief, lips curling as if what approached wasn't a soldier, but some fundamental violation of natural order. Her voice came sharp and whispered, cutting through the growing noise. "Return to your post immediately." Renner didn't answer, didn't slow down either. Charlotte had backed away from Camilla now, placing a trembling hand on the ceremonial chain that separated the royal section from the public area. She stood between worlds. The frightened child on one side, the weight of the crown on the other. The only thing approaching her was the man in scarlet. Renner reached the chain. Protocol said that's where he stopped, where every guard had always stopped. But protocol was already broken. He stepped over. In full view of every camera, every diplomat, every security officer in the forecourt, Lance Corporal Rena crossed into the royal enclosure. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged with the electricity of witnessing something that had never happened before. Camilla took a half step forward, her mask of composure slipping just enough to show the calculation behind it. "You're making a fool of yourself." Renner's response carried across the courtyard, firm and even and impossible to ignore. "She asked for help, ma'am, and I heard her." He looked down at Charlotte, not with pity but with recognition. The acknowledgement of someone who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. "I heard her," he repeated. Camilla's composure cracked completely for just a moment. Disbelief flashed across her features, followed by outrage, then the quick mental calculation of someone realizing that every eye in the forecourt was now watching her. She glanced toward the plainclothes security officers positioned near the garden walls, expecting them to restore order. None moved, because they could see what everyone else could see now. This wasn't a breach of security, and this was protection. Charlotte took a small step closer to Renner's side, not grabbing him or hiding behind him, just positioning herself where she felt safer. She didn't need to speak again. Her choice said everything. Camilla's voice dropped to a hiss that carried just far enough. "You will lose your post for this." Renner's posture remained unchanged, military bearing, rifle properly held, every inch the professional soldier. He didn't argue, didn't justify, didn't plead. He simply stood where duty had placed him, which was between a frightened child and someone who had been hurting her. Behind them, the band tried to recover their rhythm. The snare drum tapped once, twice, as if nudging the world back into some kind of order. But no one was listening to the music anymore. Every lens, every face, every pair of eyes in the forecourt was trained on the single guard in scarlet who had just rewritten 3 centuries of precedent. And the 10-year-old princess, now standing beside him, protected for the first time in her life by someone who'd chosen her safety over his career. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, long enough for every camera in the forecourt to capture what was happening, long enough for the significance to sink in. A royal guard had abandoned his post to protect a member of the royal family from another member of the royal. The first plainclothes officer broke the spell, stepping into the royal section with quiet authority. But he didn't move toward Renner. He approached Camilla. A second officer joined him, then a third. They didn't touch her, didn't raise voices, didn't create a scene, just positioned themselves with the kind of professional courtesy that made their message unmistakable. Camilla stared at them, then at Renner, then finally at Charlotte, the girl who had just brought down 3 centuries of tradition with 2 words. "This is outrageous," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "You're going to take her word over mine." The lead officer's response was diplomatically neutral. "Ma'am, we need to step back and assess the situation." It wasn't her word against Charlotte's anymore. It was everyone's eyes against the story she'd been telling about herself. Camilla looked around the forecourt once more, taking in the cameras, the crowd, the guards who had stopped their ceremony to watch her. Then she turned and walked toward the private archway behind the staging area, followed by an aide who suddenly found urgent need to study the cobblestones beneath his feet. No tantrum, no scene, just the kind of strategic withdrawal that powerful people make when they realize the battlefield has shifted. The royal section held its breath. Charlotte remained beside Renner, close enough that his red coat brushed her sleeve. She wasn't crying now, wasn't shaking, just standing quietly while the world rearranged itself around her. The security officer who had taken charge looked at her with the kind of gentle professionalism reserved for children who had been through something difficult. "You're safe now, Your Royal Highness." Charlotte nodded once, a small movement that carried enormous weight. Then she looked up at Renner with an expression that held no fear, no anxiety, no careful performance, just gratitude. "You listened," she said quietly. Renner inclined his head slightly, his formal bearing intact despite everything that had just changed. "Any guard would have done the same, Your Highness." But they both knew that wasn't true. Only one guard had been watching carefully enough to see what was really happening. Only one had been willing to throw away his career when listening mattered more than following orders. The ceremony resumed slowly, like a machine, remembering how to function after an unexpected shutdown. The drummer tapped his rhythm tentatively, then with growing confidence as the other instruments joined in. But everything had changed. Lance Corporal Theo Renner remained exactly where he had moved, inside the royal enclosure, standing beside Princess Charlotte. His boots planted, rifle properly positioned, bearing unchanged. Only now, nobody mistook him for decoration. Charlotte stayed quietly at his side, her hands still, breathing steady. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't performing either, just being a 10-year-old girl who finally felt safe. Word was already spreading through the palace staff. Renner could see it in the way security officers touched their earpieces, the slight pause before responding to whatever they were hearing. Within the palace walls, phones were ringing. Private secretaries were having very quiet, very urgent conversations. This wasn't just about a guard breaking protocol anymore. This was about what that breach had revealed. Other guards along the perimeter remained in formation, but Renner caught the almost imperceptible nods from 2 of his section mates. Johnson, who'd done 3 tours in Iraq. Davies, whose younger sister had been in an abusive foster placement before the family got her out. They understood. They would have done the same. The security perimeter had quietly reorganized itself. Without fanfare or announcement, the protection detail's focus shifted. The royal section was no longer centered around protocol. It was centered around the person who needed protecting. But Renner knew the real consequences were just beginning. Breaking rank wasn't something you walked back from. There would be investigations, disciplinary hearings, questions from people who'd never stood between a child and someone hurting them. His military career was probably over. Looking down at Charlotte, who was finally breathing normally for the first time all morning, he found he didn't care. Tourists didn't applaud, there was no cheering, but the atmosphere in the forecourt had fundamentally changed. A woman near the barriers lowered her phone, tears visible behind her sunglasses. A man in a Manchester United cap turned to his wife and said quietly, "That soldier just saved that little girl, didn't he?" All around the courtyard, people stood a little straighter, looked a little more carefully at what was happening in front of them. They'd come to see pageantry and tradition. Instead, they'd witnessed something real, something that mattered. Renner kept his eyes on the crowd, scanning for threats the way he'd been trained. But his awareness included the small presence beside him now, the responsibility he'd chosen when he stepped across that chain. Charlotte didn't look up at him again, didn't speak. But after several minutes, she straightened her shoulders without being told, not because someone demanded it, but because she felt strong enough to do it herself. Behind them, the fanfare built to its full ceremonial grandeur. The remaining guards moved through their formations with precision that spoke to generations of training. The tourists returned to their photography, though many kept glancing back at the unprecedented scene in the royal section. From across the square, a child perched on her father's shoulders waved a small Union Jack toward the red-coated figure who had broken rank to do what was right. Renner didn't wave back, but his shadow fell across Charlotte like a shield, and for the rest of that morning, the most protected person in Britain was exactly that. Protected by someone who understood that real duty meant knowing when to break the rules. The investigation took 3 days. Review boards, parliamentary questions, headlines across every newspaper in Britain. But the footage spoke for itself. A child's plea for help. A guard's response. A system that finally worked the way it was supposed to. Behind closed doors, the real reckoning was more complex. Palace staff, who'd suspected but never spoken, came forward with their own observations. The way Charlotte flinched when certain people approached, how she'd grown quieter over the past months. Small incidents that seemed minor individually, but painted a clear pattern together. Camilla's defenders tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, childhood dramatics blown out of proportion. But security footage from other events told a different story. Moments of harsh correction when cameras weren't focused. Grips that lasted too long. A pattern of behaviour that became impossible to ignore once someone finally looked. The reforms came quietly, without fanfare. New protocols for monitoring interactions with royal children. Independent welfare officers. Regular check-ins that couldn't be scheduled or prepared for. Changes that should have existed years ago, but took one guard's decision to make them necessary. Lance Corporal Theo Renner kept his post. Got a commendation, actually, though he never talked about it. More importantly, he got reassigned to Charlotte's permanent security detail, a posting that looked routine on paper, but carried profound meaning for everyone involved. The palace statement was diplomatic. Following a thorough review of protective procedures, adjustments have been made to ensure the well-being of all royal family members remains paramount. What it really meant was that they'd finally started listening. Princess Charlotte attended the next ceremony with the same quiet dignity, but something had changed in her bearing. She stood taller, looked around more freely, smiled when she felt like smiling. And when she caught Renner's eye across the forecourt, she touched her chest once, just over her heart. A small gesture that meant everything. Recognition between two people who understood that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a child finding her voice when no one else will listen. Sometimes it's a soldier choosing humanity over tradition. Sometimes it's knowing that the right choice and the easy choice are never the same thing. What would you have done if you'd seen that plea for help? Do you think there are moments when breaking the rules is the most honourable thing you can do? And how many other children are standing in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally listen when they ask for help? Let us know in the comments below where you're watching from, and whether you think Lance Corporal Renner made the right choice. If stories like this remind you why courage matters, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what we post next. Share this with someone who needs to remember that real heroes are the ones who act when everyone else is just watching. Your next story is waiting on the screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth. Sometimes the most important protocol is the one that says, protect the innocent, no matter what it costs.